Moscow, tháng 6 1733. A Romanov princess drew her last breath in silence at only 41. Catherine Ivanovna, once beaten by her husband and abandoned by her own court, spent her final years consumed by relentless chest pains. Her death brought no great funeral, no tolling bells, only the fading sound of labored breaths slipping into stillness. Yet this quiet end was not hers alone. It marked the beginning of a chain of tragedy that would engulf her daughter and her grandson in the generations to come. She was born into a palace that glittered with gold, yet trembled with uncertainty, on October 20th, 1691. In the heart of Moscow, Catherine Ivanovna came into the world. Her father, Tsar Ivan V of Russia, wore the crown but not the power. He shared the throne with his younger half-brother Peter, later known as Peter the Great. But while Peter's hands were strong, reshaping Russia with a vision of empire and modernity, Ivan's were frail, almost childlike, incapable of steering the massive ship of state. Catherine's earliest years unfolded in this peculiar twilight. Her father sat on the throne, but decisions were made elsewhere. For a young child, the gilded halls of the Kremlin might have seemed reassuring. Yet even before she could speak, her destiny was already defined by absence. Absence of power, absence of authority, absence of a father strong enough to protect her place in the hierarchy of empire. To be a daughter of the Romanovs in the late 17th century was to inherit not just privilege but also danger. The dynasty itself was young, still scarred by bloodshed and rebellion. Only 4 decades earlier, Russia had endured the time of troubles, a chaos of impostors, famine, and foreign invasions. The Romanovs had emerged victorious, but cracks remained in the fragile structure of legitimacy. Every child of the dynasty bore that weight, and Catherine, though born into velvet and ceremony, was no exception. Her mother, Praskovia Saltykova, was a woman of quiet resilience. She came from an old noble family, but not one powerful enough to challenge Peter the Great's faction. Praskovia had married Ivan V in what seemed like a dynastic compromise. She provided loyalty, faith, and children, while her husband gave her a crown, but little more. For Catherine, her mother became the only constant. When Ivan slipped further into illness, his body weak, his mind clouded, it was Praskovia who tried to hold the family together. Catherine grew up alongside her sisters, Praskovia and Maria, in a domestic circle that was more secluded than most royal courts. Without a father who commanded authority, the girls became more like ornamental figures than political players. They were Romanov princesses, yes, but Romanov princesses pushed to the margins. The Kremlin was alive with Peter's reforms, his foreign advisors, his dreams of ships and battles. But Catherine's household existed in a quieter, dimmer light. That shadow defined her identity. She was not destined to be a ruler. She was not expected to shape policy. She was, from the beginning, a symbol, a pawn to be moved on the chessboard of dynastic marriage, a vessel through which alliances might be secured. The irony of her life was that she was born into one of the greatest dynasties of Europe, yet she was invisible within it. Still, the rituals of court life touched her. The golden icons in chapel services, the stern voices of priests chanting liturgy, the echo of footsteps on cold stone corridors, all of it formed the backdrop of her childhood. But what Catherine surely noticed, even as a young girl, was the way servants and courtiers bowed lower to Peter's messengers than to her own father. She saw how her mother's table was laid with fewer dishes, how conversation stopped when she entered the room, how whispers always carried the name of Peter, never even. There is a certain cruelty in being raised to understand that you are royal, but not powerful. Catherine would have known it early. Her jewels could sparkle, her gowns could shimmer, but her words carried little weight. Every game she played with her sisters, every lesson in etiquette, was laced with the unspoken truth. Her future was not hers to command. By the age of 5, she would watch her father decline further, his health collapsing under the strain of disease and infirmity. Court physicians tried leeches, potions, prayers, but nothing restored him. He died in 1696, when Catherine was only 4. For the empire, it was a moment of consolidation. Peter emerged as the undisputed ruler. For Catherine, it was the erasure of any claim to importance. She became the daughter of a dead czar, a title with prestige but no influence. The palace that once seemed alive with possibility now felt like a cage of shadows. Her mother remained loyal, raising her daughters with dignity, but the Romanov court had shifted its center of gravity. Catherine's household became a quiet annex, tolerated but largely forgotten. The girls were educated in religion, manners, and languages, but not in politics. Unlike Peter's heirs, they were not groomed for leadership. Their destiny was clear: to be married off, to secure alliances, to disappear into foreign courts as bargaining chips. Catherine's earliest lessons in life, then, were not about power, but about its absence. She saw what it meant to live under the shadow of a stronger ruler. She felt the silence that followed when her name was mentioned in council. And she learned, perhaps too early, the kind of loneliness that comes not from being unloved, but from being unnecessary. The tragedy of Catherine Ivanovna did not begin in her adulthood with her abusive marriage. It began here, in the silent corridors of the Kremlin, where a little girl understood that she was a princess only in name, where every candlelit mass whispered a truth she could not yet speak, that her life would never be her own, that her body, her future, her very breath would belong to others. History often remembers the triumphant figures, the reformers, the conquerors, the visionaries. But in the shadows of their reigns lived those like Catherine, witnesses without voices, symbols without agency. Her childhood was not a golden promise, but a quiet prophecy, one that would unfold with relentless precision in the decades to come. For now, the young princess remained in Moscow, growing into adolescence under her mother's watch. But already the outlines of her fate were clear. She was a Romanov, but one doomed to live and die in the margins of power. When Tsar Ivan V died in 1696, Catherine Ivanovna was only 4 years old. A child too young to comprehend politics, yet old enough to sense the shift in air. In the Kremlin, mourning bells tolled, but their echo felt strangely hollow. Her father had never been the force of authority that the crown implied. His passing brought sorrow, yes, but not upheaval. To the empire, his death was an ending of convenience. The throne passed cleanly into the hands of Peter, his half-brother. For Catherine, it was the moment her family slipped further into obscurity. She had been a Tsarevna, the daughter of a reigning Tsar. Now she was the daughter of a former Tsar, a title that lost its shine the instant Ivan's heart stopped beating. In dynastic courts, power was not just about who lived, but about who mattered. And from 1696 onward, Catherine and her sisters mattered less and less. Her mother, Praskovia Saltykova, understood this instantly. Once, she had presided over receptions with the dignity of a Tsarina. Now, she was simply a widow with 3 daughters and no political role. She moved her household to a quieter corner of Moscow, away from the grand spectacles of Peter's triumphs. Peter was transforming Russia, ordering shipyards, planning wars against Sweden, inviting foreign artisans and engineers. But none of this involved Catherine's family. The little girl must have felt the dissonance. In her chambers, the routine continued. Prayers, tutors, lessons in embroidery and music. But beyond the window, the world was moving without her. She grew up in a Russia whose pulse she could feel, but not touch. The Romanov court was glittering, full of noise and change. Yet Catherine's life was increasingly muted, as if wrapped in thick cloth. Her sisters, too, shared this fate. Praskovia, the eldest, was gentle and devout, preferring a life of religion and books. Maria, younger than Catherine, was quick-witted but equally constrained by circumstance. The three sisters were bound together by their mother's protective presence, but even that shield carried the taste of resignation. They were being raised not to rule, not to influence, but to endure. In dynastic Europe, princesses were valuable currency. But the value of Catherine and her sisters was complicated. Peter the Great viewed them less as family than as pawns. He was pragmatic. Marriages for these daughters of a powerless Tsar could be arranged when needed, perhaps to cement minor alliances. Until then, they were ornaments of the court, to be displayed when convenient and hidden when not. This was the essence of their orphanhood, not just losing a father, but losing the relevance that came with him. Catherine's childhood was shadowed by the knowledge, spoken or not, that she belonged to a branch of the Romanov line that no longer mattered. The crown that had once sat on her father's head now sat firmly on Peter's, and with it went the weight of history. She may have been too young to understand the politics of the moment, but she would have felt its consequences. Invitations grew fewer. Courtiers bowed less deeply. The hum of strategy no longer reached her family's chambers. The energy of Moscow was being redirected toward shipbuilding, toward foreign wars, toward Peter's bold vision of a modern empire. Catherine's world shrank as Russia's grew, and yet there was still privilege. She wore gowns of brocade, ate from plates of silver, and walked halls that echoed with centuries of ceremony. But privilege without power is a fragile thing. It is like holding a jewel in your palm while knowing it can be taken away at any time. Catherine's life became a study in this fragility. Her position as a princess glittered on the surface but cracked beneath the weight of irrelevance. Her mother, perhaps sensing the precariousness, focused on faith. Praskovia turned her household into a place of devotion. The sisters attended services, copied prayers, and listened to sermons about endurance, humility, and patience. It was a spiritual education meant to fortify them for futures they could not yet see. But to Catherine, the lesson may have felt more like confinement. She watched as cousins and distant relatives played roles in Peter's expanding empire, while her own life was reduced to prayer books and waiting. There is a loneliness in being forgotten while still alive. Catherine carried this loneliness into adolescence. She saw Peter's daughters, born later, rise in prominence, their names whispered in discussions of succession. She, by contrast, was invisible. The court chroniclers barely mentioned her. Foreign envoys did not ask after her. Even within Moscow, she was a princess few remembered. This invisibility was its own kind of exile. She had not been banished from Russia, yet she lived as though banished from history. Her father's line was too weak to claim power, her mother too cautious to fight for recognition. Catherine's destiny was sealed in silence. She would grow into womanhood with no role in the empire her name was meant to define. By the time she reached her teenage years, Catherine was fully aware of her diminished status. The whispers in corridors were no longer muffled. She could hear them. a daughter of the forgotten Tsar, a girl with no prospects. Her beauty, her education, her lineage, they might have mattered in another age. But in Peter's Russia, where strength and ambition ruled, they were not enough. This was the meaning of being orphaned of power. Catherine lost not only her father, but also the inheritance of significance. What remained was a title without weight, a name without authority. She would carry the Romanov blood, but never the Romanov destiny. And in this paradox lay the seeds of her future tragedy: to be born royal yet powerless, visible yet invisible, cherished yet disposable. As she grew into a young woman, her mother's eyes turned toward Europe. Somewhere beyond Russia's borders, there might be a match, some duke or prince who would see value in a Romanov bride. Catherine's life would soon take a decisive turn, but not in the direction of freedom. Her orphanhood of power would lead her not to autonomy, but to a marriage that became its own prison. By the second decade of the 18th century, Catherine Ivanovna had reached the age when Romanov daughters ceased to be merely ornamental. In dynastic Europe, a princess was never her own. She was a chess piece, her hand in marriage a move on the board of diplomacy. For Catherine, who had already spent her youth in the quiet corners of Moscow, her moment came in 1716. The groom chosen for her was Karl Leopold, Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, a German prince whose domain lay far from the frozen courtyards of the Kremlin. The match was presented as an alliance. Russia sought influence in northern Germany, while Mecklenburg sought the prestige of a Romanov connection. It looked strategic on parchment, but beneath the ink lay no promise of happiness. Catherine had no choice in the matter. Few women of her rank ever did. She was told that her marriage would serve Russia, that her duty was not to herself, but to the empire. And though she had been raised in the shadows of Peter the Great's court, she knew enough to understand what was expected: obedience, submission, silence. The departure from Moscow was a ceremony of sorrow. For her mother, Praskovia Saltykova, it meant losing the daughter who had been her companion through years of widowhood. For Catherine, it meant leaving the only world she had ever known. Its onion-domed churches, its candlelit chapels, its winters heavy with snow and silence. To step onto German soil was to step into a future as foreign as the language she would be forced to speak. At first glance, Mecklenburg-Schwerin was a land of contrasts. Its ducal court was smaller than Moscow's, but rigid in its rules. Where the Russian court glimmered with Byzantine ritual and the growing influence of Western fashions, Mecklenburg clung to a colder austerity. The palaces were less splendid, the courtiers more severe. Catherine arrived not as a celebrated bride, but as a stranger whose presence was tolerated only because it served politics. Karl Leopold himself was no charming prince. Tall, broad, and imposing, he was known for his violent temper and unpredictable moods. His rule had already been marked by conflict, both with his own subjects and with neighboring states. To his court, Catherine was not a partner, but a hostage to fortune, a Romanov bride who might bring Russian support when needed. To Karl Leopold, she was a possession, a body to control, a name to exploit. For Catherine, the marriage was a betrayal in disguise. She had been told she was serving Russia. In truth, she had been discarded by it. Peter the Great had little affection for his niece. Her father had been his co-tsar, but weak and irrelevant, and Peter had long resented any figure who reminded him of that divided throne. Sending Catherine away to Mecklenburg was convenient. It removed a potential rival branch of the dynasty, while dressing the act in the polite language of diplomacy. The wedding itself bore all the grandeur expected of royal unions. Candles, choirs, the exchange of rings. But beneath the surface, Catherine knew it was hollow. No vows of love bound them, only treaties and calculations. The moment the ceremony ended, her fate was sealed. She was no longer a Romanov princess of Moscow. She was the Duchess of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, bound to a man whose cruelty was whispered about even among his own people. It is easy, centuries later, to look at dynastic marriages as abstractions, alliances, pacts, lines on a genealogical chart. But for Catherine, it was a personal exile. Each morning she awoke in a foreign court where her accent marked her as an outsider, where her customs seemed strange, where even the prayers felt unfamiliar. She had been uprooted from her mother and sisters, transplanted into soil that refused to nurture her. Letters from home became her lifeline. Praskovia wrote with affection, reminding her daughter to keep faith, to endure as a Romanov should. But paper could not embrace, and words could not shield her from the reality of her husband's nature. Karl Leopold's temper was not hidden behind closed doors. He humiliated Catherine in front of courtiers, mocked her lineage, berated her for imagined slights. What had begun as a political bargain was already curdling into a private tragedy. Catherine's isolation was profound. In Russia, she had been forgotten, yes, but she had been surrounded by familiarity. In Mecklenburg, she was actively despised. Courtiers loyal to Karl Leopold saw her as an intruder, a foreigner whose presence threatened their influence. Her attendants, Russian ladies-in-waiting who had traveled with her, were her only comfort, but even they whispered of returning home, weary of the hostility that surrounded them. What Catherine may not have known, at least at first, was that her marriage was doomed by more than personality. Karl Leopold was embroiled in disputes with his own estates, feuding with nobles, clashing with townsmen. His rule was unstable, his finances strained. Bringing a Romanov bride into this turmoil was less a triumph than a gamble. And Catherine was the stake placed on the table. In this sense, her life reflected the cruel arithmetic of royal women in early modern Europe. Their bodies were treaties, their wombs the hope of dynasties. Catherine's worth to Karl Leopold lay not in her spirit, her intellect, or her resilience, but in her capacity to bear an heir and anchor his fragile authority. She was reduced to function. Her humanity was secondary. For the young Duchess, the bargain that had been struck over her head became a chain around her neck. She had been promised a role in history, but instead she found herself a prisoner in her own household. Every insult, every outburst of violence, every cold shoulder reminded her that the empire she had been told she was serving had, in truth, abandoned her. The political bargain had been made. The ink was dry. And Catherine Ivanovna, a woman raised in the shadow of one throne, now lived in the shadow of another, this time darker, harsher, and far more dangerous. The union between Catherine Ivanovna and Karl Leopold quickly revealed itself not as a partnership, but as a cage. Whatever diplomatic hopes had been painted across the parchment of their marriage contract, they dissolved behind closed doors. Catherine, the Romanov bride who had once dreamed, perhaps faintly, of dignity in a foreign land, found herself instead trapped in a household ruled by cruelty. Karl Leopold's reputation for temper was not mere rumor. He embodied volatility, a man whose mood shifted like storm clouds, whose wrath erupted without warning. His duchy, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, was already burdened with disputes between duke and nobles, town and peasantry. But Catherine's new husband seemed to find as much battle within his own household as outside of it. She was both wife and target, an object upon which he could vent his frustrations. For Catherine, raised in the relative gentleness of her mother's Moscow court, The descent into violence must have been jarring. In Russia, she had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as insignificant, but never degraded in the way Karl Leopold now degraded her. He hurled insults that stripped away her dignity, mocking her origins, her accent, her family. To him, she was not the daughter of a czar, but a pawn sent by Peter the Great to remind him of his dependency. The Romanov blood that should have protected her became, in his eyes, a mark of resentment. The abuse was not only verbal. Accounts from contemporaries speak of Karl Leopold's physical brutality, his willingness to strike his wife, to impose his dominance with force. These were not moments hidden from servants or courtiers. Catherine's humiliation was public, deliberate. To a duke obsessed with authority, to demean his wife was to assert his supremacy. She could not fight back, could not appeal to law or counsel. Her marriage had made her subject to his will. In the cold chambers of Schwerin's ducal palace, Catherine lived a paradox. She was a Romanov princess, yet she was treated like a prisoner. The ceremonies of her station continued: banquets, receptions, appearances beside her husband. But these were performances staged before a hostile audience. Behind the painted walls and chandeliers, she bore the bruises of his cruelty, the scars invisible, but no less real. Her attendants, loyal women from Russia, did what they could. They whispered comfort, offered prayers, and tried to shield her from the worst of Karl Leopold's rages. But they were powerless against a duke whose word was law in his duchy. They could not intervene when his voice rose to a shout, when his hand struck the table, or her. They could not challenge the system that made Catherine not a person, but property. Perhaps the most piercing cruelty was isolation. In Russia, though sidelined, Catherine had at least been among her own people, her mother and sisters. In Mecklenburg, she was utterly alone. Foreign tongues filled her ears, foreign customs shaped her days. Every insult reminded her that she was not one of them. Even the air of Schwerin seemed to weigh against her, damp, heavy, carrying none of the familiarity of Moscow's winter frost. The violence of her marriage was not only physical, but spiritual. Each time Karl Leopold belittled her, Catherine's identity fractured further. She had been born in the shadow of one throne. Now she was forced to live under the shadow of a tyrant. Her Romanov name, once a source of pride, had become a weapon wielded against her. To Karl Leopold, she was a reminder that his duchy was small, his influence precarious, his reliance on greater powers humiliating. He lashed out, and she bore the cost. In the midst of this turmoil, Catherine found herself pregnant. For many royal women, the hope of an heir softened a husband's disdain. But for Catherine, the promise of motherhood was not a rescue, but another burden. Karl Leopold's temper did not cool. If anything, it grew harsher, his expectations heavier. He saw her pregnancy not as a bond between them, but as proof of his control. Still, within her swelling belly grew a fragile spark of solace. For the first time since leaving Moscow, Catherine held something that was truly hers: a child, a life not dictated by treaties or councils. This unborn infant became her anchor amid the storm, a reminder that even in violence, love could survive in secret. But even motherhood could not shield her from Karl Leopold's rages. Pregnancy slowed her steps, weakened her body, but it did not slow his fury. Servants whispered of nights when the Duchess wept alone, clutching her stomach, praying that the child within would not feel the blows of the world outside. Her prayers, whispered in Russian, must have sounded foreign in the cold stone halls. but they were the only language of comfort she still owned. The court around her watched with a mixture of disdain and indifference. Some pitied her, but most saw her suffering as irrelevant. Catherine was an outsider, a pawn married for politics. Her pain was hers alone to endure. In Mecklenburg, sympathy was a scarce currency, and no one was willing to spend it on a foreign duchess. The tragedy of this marriage was not unique. Many royal women endured violence behind gilded doors. But Catherine's plight was sharpened by the irony of her birth. She was the daughter of a czar, niece to the most powerful ruler Russia had ever known. Yet here she was, powerless before a duke whose duchy was barely a fragment of Europe's political map. History can be merciless in its contrasts. Her uncle commanded armies, built cities, changed empires. She, meanwhile, was silenced in her own bedchamber. Catherine's marriage was supposed to bind Russia and Mecklenburg. Instead, it bound her to misery. Each day was a rehearsal of survival, speaking little, avoiding his gaze when anger darkened it, enduring what could not be escaped. For a woman who had once been overlooked, invisibility might have seemed bearable. But in Mecklenburg, invisibility was replaced by degradation, a humiliation that stripped even silence of dignity. The bargain had been made. The marriage could not be undone. And Catherine Ivanovna, trapped in the cold halls of Schwerin, learned the harshest lesson of her life: that even royal blood cannot protect a woman from violence when the world has already decided she exists only to serve. In 1718, 2 years into her storm-tossed marriage, Catherine Ivanovna gave birth to a daughter. The infant was named Anna Leopoldovna. In a world that had stripped Catherine of dignity, this child became her only solace. For a brief moment, the cries of a newborn drowned out the shouts of her husband. The little girl's tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's, and Catherine felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that her life still contained meaning. The birth did not repair the marriage. Karl Leopold did not soften. He viewed the baby as an heir, proof of his virility, a continuation of his line. But to Catherine, Anna was not a symbol. She was a living fragment of love in a life otherwise consumed by fear. In the cold, hostile halls of Schwerin, the nursery became Catherine's sanctuary. Within its walls, she could sing Russian lullabies, cradle her daughter in silence, and imagine that beyond the cracked facade of her marriage, there existed a world where tenderness had not been extinguished. Anna's presence gave Catherine strength. Where once she had endured humiliation in silence, now she endured for someone. Each insult, each strike from Karl Leopold was born with the knowledge that she must live, if only to protect her child. She began to withdraw even further from the public rituals of the court, focusing her energy on motherhood. To courtiers, she seemed cold, aloof, withdrawn. In truth, she was conserving her spirit, shielding it for her daughter. But even this fragile peace was fragile indeed. Karl Leopold, suspicious and volatile, grew jealous of the bond between mother and child. He accused Catherine of coddling, of turning Anna against him. He wanted the girl raised in the stern traditions of Mecklenburg, not in the soft Russian songs Catherine whispered by candlelight. His anger flared at the sight of mother and child laughing together, as if joy itself were a defiance of his authority. Still, Catherine clung to Anna. In her daughter's eyes, she saw continuity. Romanov and Mecklenburg blood intertwined, but also a chance, however faint, for renewal. Anna might grow to escape the shadow that had suffocated her mother. She might become the bridge between two worlds, the proof that suffering could still yield resilience. Catherine poured all her hope into that possibility. Yet hope was dangerous. The more Catherine leaned on Anna for comfort, the more Karl Leopold resented it. His marriage was already collapsing under the weight of his cruelty, but now his household split along sharper lines. On one side stood Catherine and her daughter, bound in love and survival. On the other stood the Duke, isolated in his rage, lashing out with increasing violence. For Catherine, the nursery became both sanctuary and battlefield. She would hush Anna's cries when shouts echoed through the palace, cradling the infant close as if her arms could shield against words. She would press kisses to her child's forehead, whispering in Russian of angels and saints, teaching prayers not in the language of Mecklenburg, but in the tongue of her homeland. Each gesture was defiance, an assertion that no matter how powerless she was as a duchess, she would not be powerless as a mother. There were fleeting moments when Catherine allowed herself to dream. She imagined returning to Moscow with Anna, raising her among her sisters and her mother, in a circle of women who understood exile. She dreamed of the Kremlin's chapels, of candles flickering before icons, of a home where her daughter would not have to fear a father's temper. These dreams sustained her, but they also deepened her pain, for each day reminded her how far from Moscow she remained. Her letters to her mother reveal the tension of those years. They carried both hope and despair. She spoke of Anna's health, her first steps, her early words, but woven into those maternal details were notes of loneliness, of longing for support, of fear that she could not protect her daughter forever. Praskovia Saltykova, now an aging widow in Moscow, could offer only words in return: encouragement, prayers, reminders that endurance was itself a form of victory. But Catherine knew better. Endurance was survival, not triumph. She could endure for herself, but could Anna? What inheritance could she pass to her daughter beyond sorrow? In the stillness of night, when the palace finally fell quiet, Catherine must have stared into the cradle and wondered whether love alone could shield a child from a world built on cruelty. Meanwhile, Karl Leopold's duchy continued to crumble. His disputes with nobles worsened, his finances faltered, and his authority weakened. Catherine, though no longer the direct target of political gossip, still felt the tremors. When her husband quarreled with his estates, his rage returned to the household. When his plans failed, his voice rose in fury at his wife and child. Anna, even as a toddler, witnessed her mother's tears, the tension in her body. The silences that followed slammed doors. For Catherine, motherhood was no fairy tale redemption. It was a fragile shield against despair. She lived not in peace, but in a constant state of vigilance, watching her husband, calculating his moods, measuring the safety of her daughter by the slope of his brow. Her love for Anna was not just affection, but strategy. A desperate attempt to carve out an island of tenderness in an ocean of violence. And yet, even in this prison, there was light. Catherine taught her daughter to smile, to laugh, to play. She taught her the words of songs from her homeland, instilling memories that would carry into adulthood. In giving Anna these gifts, Catherine preserved a piece of herself. She could not stop the tide of history, but she could plant within her daughter the seeds of resilience. In the end, Anna was more than Catherine's only comfort. She was Catherine's defiance. In a world that sought to reduce her to silence, Catherine found her voice in motherhood. Her lullabies, her whispered prayers, her unwavering protection. These were acts of rebellion as profound as any battle. They did not change the cruelty of her husband, nor the indifference of Europe. But they changed Catherine herself. She was no longer merely a forgotten Romanov princess or a battered duchess. She was a mother, and in that role, she found a measure of dignity that violence could not strip away. For years, Catherine endured. She endured the blows, the insults, the isolation. She endured because she had Anna, and because there seemed no escape from Karl Leopold's grasp. But endurance, even for the strongest, has limits. By the early 1720s, Catherine reached hers. Her marriage had become a spectacle of failure. Karl Leopold's cruelty was no longer confined to his household. His quarrels with his own nobles had escalated into open rebellion. The estates of Mecklenburg petitioned foreign rulers, begging for intervention. Even the Holy Roman Emperor looked with scorn upon the Duke who had reduced his duchy to chaos. In this climate, Catherine's suffering was both personal and political. She was trapped in a court where humiliation was daily fare, tethered to a man despised by his subjects. And yet, quietly, she began to consider what once seemed impossible: leaving. Few royal women dared such defiance. Divorce was nearly unthinkable. Separation, a scandal. A duchess abandoning her husband risked dishonor not only for herself, but for her dynasty. But Catherine was a Romanov. Though forgotten, though overlooked, she carried within her veins the blood of czars. And she had Anna to protect. The moment of decision was not a dramatic escape in the night, but a slow accumulation of desperation. Each argument, each act of violence, each lonely tear drew her closer to the brink. Finally, she chose survival over silence. She would leave Mecklenburg. She would go home. The journey itself was an act of defiance. With her daughter in her arms, Catherine departed the court that had mocked her, the palace that had bruised her body and spirit. Every mile carried her further from Schwerin's stone walls and closer to Moscow's onion domes. She must have felt both terror and relief. Terror at what awaited her, relief that she had broken the chain. Few women of her rank had done the same, but Moscow was not the sanctuary she had imagined. When Catherine returned with Anna, she expected, perhaps, some measure of sympathy. Had she not suffered enough? Had she not proven her endurance? Yet Peter the Great's court was not inclined to embrace failures. To them, Catherine was a complication, a Romanov princess who had abandoned her dynastic duty. Instead of triumph, she was greeted with suspicion, even disdain. Peter himself viewed her return as an annoyance. He had married her off to remove her from Russia's stage, to tidy away a branch of the family that reminded him of the divided throne of his youth. And now she had returned, with a child in tow, a visible reminder that the Romanovs had not rid themselves of Ivan V's line. To a ruler obsessed with control, this was unacceptable. Thus, Catherine was received not as a returning daughter, but as a guest without welcome. She was given quarters in Moscow, allowed to live in modest comfort, but excluded from the center of power. Her mother, Praskovia Saltykova, still alive, embraced her, offering love and shelter. But beyond the circle of her family, Catherine was marked as troublesome, a princess whose presence unsettled the carefully curated hierarchy of the court. For Catherine, the sting was profound. She had escaped one prison only to find another. In Mecklenburg, she had been abused, despised, and silenced. In Moscow, she was ignored. The contrast was almost crueler. To be beaten is to know that you matter enough to provoke violence. To be forgotten is to realize you matter not at all. Yet Catherine did not regret her choice. For Anna's sake, she had left. And for Anna's sake, she would endure Moscow's indifference. The little girl thrived in the company of her grandmother and aunts, surrounded by Russian customs, language, and faith. Catherine watched her daughter grow, and in that growth, she found enough consolation to bear her own invisibility. But the whispers never stopped. Courtiers referred to her as the troublesome princess, the one who had failed in marriage. They muttered about her husband's accusations, about her inability to keep peace in her household. In a world where women were blamed for the failings of men, Catherine carried the stigma. Her reputation was tarnished, not by what she had done, but by what had been done to her. Even her Romanov kin kept their distance. Her cousins, nieces, and nephews moved in circles of influence that Catherine could no longer touch. She was a relic, a symbol of an older line, a daughter of the forgotten Tsar. The glittering lights of Peter's reforms, his ships, his armies, his westernized court shone bright, but Catherine lived in their shadows. Still, there was resilience in her return. In leaving Karl Leopold, she had done what many women dared not. She had declared that survival mattered more than appearances. She had chosen her daughter over her reputation. In that choice lay a quiet courage, one that history rarely acknowledges but which deserves remembrance. The years that followed were marked by obscurity. Catherine lived quietly in Moscow, attending family gatherings, appearing at religious ceremonies, but never at the forefront. She was a Romanov in blood, but not in influence. Her name faded from records, her presence from memory. And yet, within the small circle of her household, she was a mother who had fought to reclaim her life. Her story at this point might seem like an ending, a woman beaten, abandoned, forgotten, but history rarely ends so neatly. For Catherine Ivanovna, the act of leaving her husband was not the conclusion of her tragedy, but the midpoint. The pain of her past would follow her, inscribed in her body as illness began to take hold. And worse still, her daughter, the very reason she had endured, the only light in her darkness, would inherit not freedom, but the curse of her lineage. Catherine had returned to Russia seeking refuge. What she found was exile within her own home. And as the years slipped by, she must have wondered whether she had escaped one prison only to be locked within another. Catherine Ivanovna returned to Moscow with her daughter. But she did not return to a place of honor. She had expected hardship. She had not expected erasure. Once, she had been invisible in Mecklenburg because she was foreign. Now she was invisible in Russia because she was inconvenient. Peter the Great's empire was surging forward. He was building a navy, crushing Sweden, reforming the army, demanding that nobles shave their beards and learn the manners of Western Europe. Against this backdrop, what was Catherine? A widow in all but name, a duchess without a duchy, a Romanov without influence. Her quarters in Moscow were comfortable enough, gilded icons, silk curtains, loyal attendants, but they felt like a gilded cage. No summons to councils arrived, no courtiers visited to seek her favor. Her life was reduced to small rituals, morning prayers, supervising her household, watching Anna grow. She was still technically Her Highness the Tsarevna, but the title rang hollow. It was a costume she wore without a stage to perform upon. In these years, Catherine learned the peculiar cruelty of being forgotten. Pain inflicted by an enemy cuts sharp and fast. Neglect inflicted by one's own family cuts deeper and slower. When the imperial family gathered for great feasts, her presence was tolerated but not cherished. She was seated away from the center, her words ignored, her very existence a reminder of a past Peter wished to bury. The reign of her father Ivan, the coat Tsar who had never truly ruled. Her sisters shared her obscurity. Praskovia and Maria, like Catherine, had grown into adulthood without power, without marriages of note, without roles in the empire's stage. Together, the three daughters of Ivan V became shadows in the Kremlin's corridors. Courtiers would nod politely as they passed, but the respect was perfunctory, not genuine. Their lineage commanded recognition, but their lives commanded nothing. For Catherine, who had endured the brutality of Mecklenburg, this neglect was a different kind of torment. It did not bruise the skin, but wore down the soul. Days blurred together, years slipped by without event. The court around her moved like a river, vibrant and relentless. While she stood on the bank, unable to enter the current, she devoted herself to her daughter as a way of pushing back against oblivion. Anna was her purpose, her daily reason to rise from bed. Catherine saw in her child a chance at redemption, a way to carve meaning from her own insignificance. She taught Anna the prayers of her homeland, the etiquette of the court, the resilience that had kept her alive. She whispered stories of her father Ivan, not as a czar, but as a man, a memory worth preserving in a court eager to erase him. Yet Catherine knew that Anna's future was uncertain. Her husband, Karl Leopold, still lived, though estranged and disgraced in his duchy. The girl carried his blood, his name. Would the Russian court ever fully embrace her? Or would Anna, like her mother, live suspended between worlds, foreign in Mecklenburg, unwanted in Moscow? These questions haunted Catherine in the quiet hours of the night. The forgotten years were also years of watching from afar. Catherine witnessed Peter's triumphs, the founding of St. Petersburg, the expansion of Russian power. But they meant little to her. She was not part of them, not asked to share in the glory. She lived instead in the slow decay of obscurity, her own body beginning to betray her. By her 30s, whispers of her declining health began. Servants noted her pallor, her frequent rest, her shortness of breath. These were the first shadows of the illness that would consume her in middle age. Still, she endured. She dressed in finery when required, walked with her sisters through palace gardens, played the role expected of a sidelined princess. To the world, she appeared docile, quiet, perhaps even content. But inside, Catherine must have wrestled with despair. She had escaped violence only to be suffocated by silence. The irony of her life was bitter. She had once longed to leave Mecklenburg, to return to Russia, to be free of her husband's cruelty. And she had achieved that. But freedom had not brought power or peace. It had brought neglect. History has no patience for women who do not fit its grand narratives. Catherine was not a reformer, not a ruler, not even a scandalous rebel. She was a survivor, and survivors are often the first to be forgotten. For Anna, however, these forgotten years were formative. She grew beneath her mother's watchful eye, absorbing the quiet strength of a woman who had endured humiliation but refused to surrender tenderness. Catherine might have been erased from the stage of empire, but within the confines of her household, she created something that mattered, a sanctuary of maternal devotion, a memory of love her daughter would carry into adulthood. And yet, the tragedy of Catherine's life was that even this devotion could not alter her fate. Her name did not appear in the chronicles of Peter's victories. Her presence did not influence the succession debates that stirred the court. She lived and moved as a ghost among the living, seen but unseen, acknowledged but irrelevant. The forgotten years left their mark in another way too, on Catherine's body. Her chest pains, once fleeting, grew more frequent. At first she brushed them aside, mere exhaustion, she told herself. But as the pain deepened, as breathing grew harder, she must have realized that time itself was conspiring to erase her. Illness, like neglect, was invisible until it became undeniable. And so, while the empire around her thundered forward into modernity, Catherine Ivanovna remained behind. A princess in name, a shadow in truth. Forgotten by the state, remembered only by those closest to her, she lived out her 30s in a twilight of obscurity, preparing, though she did not yet know it, for the final act of her tragedy. By the time Catherine Ivanovna entered her 30s, her body began to betray her as cruelly as history had. The forgotten princess, once hidden by indifference, now found herself haunted by pain that would not release its grip. It started with a tightening in her chest, a sharpness when she climbed stairs, a heaviness after long evenings in the cold Moscow air. Servants thought it was fatigue, perhaps nerves. Catherine herself dismissed it at first. But the pains returned, stubborn, insistent. They became her shadow. The medical knowledge of 18th century Russia was primitive, a mix of folk remedies, church prayers, and half-learned European techniques. Physicians spoke of imbalances of humors, of cold wind in the chest. Some prescribed bleeding, others offered bitter herbal drafts. Catherine submitted, because there was little else she could do. Cups of hot herbs, compresses pressed to her breast, whispered prayers before icons. These were her treatments. None brought relief. Her attendants described nights when she sat upright in bed, unable to lie down for fear of suffocation. They saw her clutch her ribs as if to hold her body together. Her sighs grew more frequent, her laughter more rare. The vibrant mother who had once cradled Anna in song now spoke softly, her voice weakened by exhaustion. Pain was not an occasional visitor. It had become her constant companion. The irony was merciless. Catherine had survived an abusive husband, had endured exile and neglect, only to be undone by her own failing body. She was not old by the standards of her age. Women in the Romanov family often lived into their 50s or 60s. But Catherine seemed destined to burn out early. Every month brought more weakness. Every year took something from her: her stamina, her energy, her freedom. Illness confined her world. She no longer walked with her sisters through the palace gardens. The scent of flowers in spring was replaced by the bitter smoke of candles in her chambers. She attended fewer gatherings, pleading frailty. At first, courtiers gossiped about her delicate constitution. Later, they barely noticed her absence at all. What was one more forgotten princess in a court that glorified power and ignored weakness? For Anna, still a child, her mother's illness was both frightening and formative. She watched Catherine pale, watched her hands tremble as she embroidered, watched her eyes cloud with pain. Yet Catherine tried to shield her daughter from despair. Even in agony, she whispered lullabies, smiled through weakness, told stories of saints who had suffered, yet triumphed. She wanted Anna to remember not her decline, but her endurance. But children are perceptive. Anna must have felt the fear beneath the comfort. She must have seen the candlelight flicker across her mother's strained face, must have heard the silence that followed Catherine's prayers. Perhaps she learned too early that suffering is inherited, that tragedy flows through blood as surely as lineage. Catherine's faith deepened in these years. Illness drew her closer to the church. Icons crowded her chamber: the Mother of God, Saint Nicholas, Saint Catherine. She prayed for healing, but more often, she prayed for strength, to endure another day, to live long enough to guide Anna into adulthood, to leave behind something more than silence. Yet even in prayer, she must have felt the bitterness of neglect. Her uncle, Peter the Great, was forging a new empire, celebrated across Europe. and she, his niece, lived quietly in pain, her existence acknowledged by no one outside her household. The pain itself became a metaphor for her life. It was persistent, invisible to outsiders, gnawing at her dignity as neglect had gnawed at her status. Just as she had once been sidelined in the court, she was now sidelined within her own body. To live with chronic illness is to live in constant negotiation between what one wishes and what one can endure. Catherine's life narrowed, her dreams shrank, her world became smaller each year. By her late 30s, the illness had worsened. Some accounts suggest tuberculosis, others suspect chronic heart disease. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. She could not escape the tightening grip of pain. Each breath felt like a bargain. Each step across her chambers felt like a pilgrimage. She had lived most of her life without control, and now even her body joined the list of things she could not command. The court around her hardly noticed. Peter the Great died in 1725, and the empire entered a new phase of succession struggles. Empress Catherine I, then Peter II, then Anna of Russia. The throne shifted, factions schemed, history thundered forward. But Catherine Ivanovna was absent from the stage. She was alive, yes, but in seclusion, fading like a candle burning too quickly in the dark. In this way, her illness became her final exile. Not sent abroad, not imprisoned in a fortress, but confined within her own failing flesh. The world had taken away her power, her marriage, her dignity. Now it was taking her breath. And yet, even as her body weakened, her role as mother remained her last act of defiance. She poured what strength she had into Anna. She taught her daughter resilience, caution, the hard lessons she had learned through pain. She wanted Anna to survive, to endure where she had been broken. If Catherine herself was fading, she would not allow her child to fade with her. But destiny is not kind to those who live in the margins of power. Catherine's life was drawing toward its quiet end. Her chest pain deepened, her body weakened, her world narrowed to the walls of her chamber. A princess in name, forgotten in reality, she bore her suffering with the same silence that had marked her entire existence. Her failing body was not just the story of an illness. It was the story of a woman who had been reduced to fragility long before sickness set in. Her death had already begun years earlier, in the neglect of her court, in the blows of her husband, in the silence of her family. Illness only completed what life had already begun, the slow erasure of Catherine Ivanovna. On June 14, 1733, in the quiet chambers of Moscow, Catherine Ivanovna's long decline ended. She was only 41 years old. For weeks, her body had been failing, every breath a labor, every movement a weight. Those close to her recalled the sound of her breathing, the shallow rasp, the pauses that seemed too long, the sudden gasp as though she were surfacing from deep water. Death did not come swiftly. It crept day by day until it finally claimed her. There was no great vigil at her bedside, no court assembled in mourning. She was not an empress, not a regent, not a figure who could alter the empire's fate. She was merely a Romanov princess whose life had been marked by neglect. Her mother was gone, her sisters distant, her uncle Peter the Great long dead. The empire had other concerns: succession disputes, wars, reforms. Catherine's passing was hardly noticed beyond her own household. And yet, within those walls, the scene was intimate and tragic. Her daughter Anna, then 15, was there. For Anna, the sight of her mother's decline must have been etched into memory. The pale face against white pillows, the chest rising with effort. the hand reaching weakly for hers. Catherine had spent her life shielding Anna from cruelty, but she could not shield her from this final moment. Death, like history, is merciless in its lessons. The attendants lit candles, their flames trembling in the summer air. Icons crowded the room, the Virgin and the saints staring down in silence. Priests recited prayers for the dying, their voices low and rhythmic. Catherine herself whispered what words she could, crossing herself with trembling fingers. She prayed not for her own soul, perhaps, but for her daughter's future, for strength, for protection, for mercy. When the end came, it was quiet. No dramatic cry, no sudden collapse, just a slowing of breath, a pause that stretched too long, and then silence. Catherine Ivanovna, daughter of a Tsar, niece of Peter the Great, Duchess of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, mother of Anna Leopoldovna, was gone. A life of 41 years, extinguished like a candle in an empty room. Her death was recorded, but barely. No grand funeral processions moved through Moscow's streets. No foreign envoys sent messages of condolence. She was buried with the rites due to her rank, but without splendor, without the resonance of loss that accompanied greater figures. In the chronicles of the Romanovs, her passing was a footnote. And yet, the true weight of her death lay not in what was written, but in what was left behind. For Anna, it was the loss of her anchor. Her mother had been her shield, her teacher, her comfort. Now at 15, she was alone in a court that had never embraced her, burdened by a legacy both Romanov and Mecklenburg, neither fully one nor the other. Catherine's death left her daughter vulnerable, exposed to the same forces of politics and neglect that had crushed her own life. What is striking about Catherine's end is how it mirrored her life. She had been born in the shadow of power, and she died in the shadow of obscurity. She had endured violence, exile, neglect, and illness. Her final years were not marked by rebellion or redemption, but by silence. She did not choose her life, and she did not choose her death. Both were imposed upon her by forces beyond her control: family, husband, empire, and finally, disease. But within that silence, there was dignity. To suffer without recognition is itself a kind of strength. Catherine endured humiliation without surrendering her tenderness for Anna. She endured neglect without abandoning faith. She endured illness without bitterness toward those who ignored her. In her quiet way, she left behind a lesson. Survival, even without glory, is its own form of resistance. Her death at 41 was premature, yet not unusual in an age when medicine offered little hope. What was unusual was the way it was forgotten. Other Romanov deaths, violent, dramatic, political, echoed through history. Catherine's faded almost immediately, remembered only by genealogists and chroniclers, a line in a book, a date on a page. The tragedy of her life was not only that she suffered, but that her suffering was erased. Still, history has a way of circling back. Though Catherine herself slipped into obscurity, the chain of her blood would not. Her daughter would rise briefly to prominence, and her grandson would wear the crown, however briefly, before being destroyed by it. Catherine's death at 41 was not the end of her story, but the prologue to another tragedy. For the moment, however, her chamber in Moscow fell silent. The candles burned low, the priests departed, the servants wept quietly. Anna, left to grieve, carried the memory of her mother's pain and endurance into a future neither could have foreseen. Catherine Ivanovna was gone, but her absence would shape the lives of those who remained. Catherine's death at 41 did not break the chain of suffering. Her daughter Anna Leopoldovna briefly ruled as regent for her infant son, Ivan VI. But power brought no safety. Anna was imprisoned and died in captivity. Ivan, Catherine's grandson, spent his childhood locked in a fortress, murdered at 23. What began as Catherine's quiet decline rippled forward, a dynasty marked not by triumph, but by imprisonment, loneliness, and violent ends.